So I remember even thinking, like, what would I call this book? And I thought, rocks, roots, and rattlesnakes. That's perfect, because that's what you're looking at. You know, so you don't trip and hurt yourself, break an ankle or whatever. I mean, you're always looking for the next rock and avoiding the roots. And certainly in the afternoon, in the summertime, you're looking for rattlesnakes on every step of the way. That exactly describes, what my focus is nearly the whole time on the trail.
This is Unconditioning, Discovering the Voice Within, with Whitney Ann Jenkins. Hello, and welcome to the 35th episode of Unconditioning, Discovering the Voice Within, where I bring on guests and we talk about the inner authentic voice and the challenges and the rewards that come from following it. This week I have with me Craig Eckert. Craig is a retired geoscience advisor living in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And throughout his 38-year career as a geologist, he's worked for numerous companies in the exploration and production sector of the petroleum industry. And during that time, he also found a passion of exploring the earth in search for hydrocarbons. And that adventure did not stop there, as he, in 2020, walked the entire Appalachian Trail and wrote a book about his experiences called Rocks, Roots, and Rattlesnakes. Craig is also a former coworker and a colleague and friend of my dad. And so it was fun to talk to him about his experiences working with my dad and how the industry has changed over the years, and just a delightful person. So here is Craig talking about his newest release of his first book, Rocks, Roots, and Rattlesnakes. Yeah. So how are you?
I'm doing great. I've been busy just advertising my book and preparing for a talk I'm going to be giving on Thursday at the PAPG. So looking forward to that. And
yeah, what is your talk on?
So I'm going to talk about my Appalachian Trail trip back in 2020, and it's being I'm addressing a geological group, right? The PAPG, about that.
Yeah.
And so I added a lot more geology to the talk than I had in my book. I mean, I have a lot of geology in the book, but it's just musings, here and there about some of the rocks that I encountered from time to time. Whereas I'm trying to do a little bit more of an overview of, why the rocks are where they are, and focus more on that than the other parts of my story. So I'm just addressing the audience and what they would probably find more interesting.
Yeah, that's cool. You can adjust your story to fit a certain niche, so to speak.
Yeah, that's right.
So my podcast is about following your authentic voice, which I feel like you probably encountered on your trip on the Appalachian Trail quite a bit with your thoughts by yourself. One of the first questions that I ask my guests is, when is the first time that you realized that you had this voice inside of yourself that was guiding you, and it wasn't influenced by your family or your environment or your education, but it was purely just something that you knew was guiding you?
Well, I guess that's a good question, and I don't know that I've given that a great deal of thought. Although I can probably say that what I did over the last couple of years, and these various hikes, in particular the Appalachian Trail through hike, it's something that's always been of interest to me, and I just haven't really had the time because of work and other obligations to do something like that. So I guess you could say that might have been my inner voice sort of coaxing me along to, fulfill some of my goals that I had, that I now have the opportunity to take advantage of.
Yeah.
And so maybe that would be my interpretation of how to answer your question.
Yeah. Okay, that's fine. Let's go back to when you first became interested in geology. and rocks in general. Do you have a specific moment that you realized that?
Um, well, I can't say that when I was young, I wanted to be a geologist, but when I was young, I was always kind of interested in the outdoors and rocks and things like that. And but I was really naive in many ways. Like for example, the career that I went into was petroleum geology, and I really didn't even know much about there being an oil industry, let alone a major bituminous coal industry, anywhere near me. I knew about the anthracite region because a lot of my relatives on my mother's side, they came from that area, and some of them had worked in the coal mines. And so when I thought of, you know, fossil fuels, I guess, which is the field that I went into, um, all I really knew about was, that small aspect of it, the anthracite region up in east central Pennsylvania. And so when I first got to college, I took one of my first science classes. My first science class, I believe, was a Geology 101 class. And just a few weeks into that class, I thought, oh, this is the coolest thing in the world. And I immediately changed my major to geology. And then, I never looked back. So that would have been perhaps the turning point where I decided that, I wanted to be a geologist. And from there on, it just flowed.
Yeah. So when you were younger, did your family encourage you to explore the outdoors?
Well, so I guess I grew up in a time when, you know, we would go outside after school every day and not come home until dinner.
Right.
And I'm sure a lot of young people still do that today, but it's more common that, they're inside, you know, doing something on either a video game or, TV or whatever. And not to say that we didn't watch TV, of course we did, but it just seemed like we spent an awful lot of time in our spare time outdoors, just running around the fields. And we had a field in our backyard, and behind that there was sort of this big drainage ditch for the neighborhood, and it was kind of a cool place to explore and play. And so we spent a lot of time there, and just riding bikes around, on weekends, and not coming home for hours. And that was perfectly fine. And no one thought that it was dangerous or anything like that, because maybe it was a little bit of a simpler, safer time in those days. So, yeah, I guess the encouragement to just explore, your world outside around you was a little bit more encouraged by parents in those days than
Yeah.
it might be today.
Sort of
Sure.
like stay out of my hair and go play outside.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I often think about that one. I've seen this a couple of times. It's a short little comedy sketch. I think it was from SNL, and it was, the difference between when the doorbell rang when you were a kid versus when the doorbell rings today. And in the old days, everyone was excited. They all gathered around the door to see who it was. And today, everyone hides behind the couches. I know it's an exaggeration, but it's sort of a
Yeah.
little example of the differences.
Yeah. Did you grow up with any kind of religious influences or belief
I did.
systems? Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, when I was growing up, we went to church every Sunday, Sunday school prior to church every Sunday morning. And then we had youth group. I guess when I was, I don't know when that started, maybe 12 years old or something like that, maybe a little younger. But we would get together Sunday nights, I believe it was Sunday nights, and have youth group meetings with our youth group leaders, usually at their house. And our group consisted of anywhere from 10 to 20 a year or two of each other. And then my mom was a Sunday school teacher. My dad was on the consistory. And so we just went to church every single Sunday.
Yeah.
That's just how it was. Mhm.
So what I'm thinking is that you went from that life to studying science in college, and so I'm wondering if that challenged your belief system at all as far as religion goes, mixing it
I
with
never
science.
found, yeah, I see what you're asking. And I never really felt like there was an issue between believing, having faith, whatever that means to different
Right.
people, right? And believing in, well, I hate to use the word believing in science, because you don't believe in science, you believe in a religion. You understand science and um, learn about it, and apply those facts to experiences and experimentation, etc. But I never found that there was really, for me, there was really no problem having both. I mean, we did have friends who I guess I would consider young earthers, and it was always interesting having discussions with them about, their views on the age of the earth, and then
Right.
what geological evidence, demonstrates. I mean, we know approximately the age of the earth, and there's all sorts of, isotopic testing of various elements that can confirm that, and so forth. Um, but anyway, yeah, it just, I mean, everyone has their own belief systems, and
Right.
so I never really bothered me, but it was always kind of interesting to have those conversations.
Yeah, I bet.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when you decided to go into geology, was there a point where petroleum geology became the central focus for you?
Well, I mean, actually, unbeknownst to me, when I was at West Virginia University, um, the program was very much focused on training young geologists to know everything they needed to know to be a successful petroleum geologist. And I'm sure that was brought up, many times,
Mm.
but it kind of fell on deaf ears for me, and I really didn't know that's what I was being trained for. I mean, maybe I did, but I don't really remember. But that's how it seems when I think back on it. I just remember that all my courses were really interesting. I enjoyed them, and it was what I wanted to do, but I didn't really know what I was going to do with it when I graduated. And I remember, after graduation, I just went around to, local companies all around Pennsylvania that might have been in the geotechnical field, or environmental geology, and I don't remember what else, but I had a lot of interviews, but they weren't in petroleum. And it wasn't until, um, a little time after that, several months maybe, I don't remember what the timing was, but that I started realizing that, what I was really trained for was oil and gas geology. And so then I started banging on doors for those kinds of jobs, and eventually I did get one, and just went on from there.
And so, where did that take you? Because I know that you've worked all across the country within this profession. So,
Yeah. So
what was the first job that you acquired as a petroleum geologist, and what was that experience like?
yeah, so it was interesting. So actually, the first job that I had was with a very small company in West Virginia, and it only lasted about 3 weeks. And I actually quit that job because I thought that I was going to be working with, maps and looking at rocks, and I don't know what I thought, but what they wanted me to do was chase rigs, which is, commonly what a lot of young geologists start out doing. But that really wasn't what I had in mind. And I felt like I was going to be trapped in that type of a position, for too long, and that really wasn't what I wanted to do. And so anyway, I left that after 3 weeks, and then finally, um, after many weeks, or I don't know how long it was anymore, but of persistent inquiries to a company called Consolidated Gas in Clarksburg, West Virginia. I ended up getting a position there, and they had so many geologists coming and going because it was at the height of one of the booms in the late 70s. And in this industry, it's always been boom bust cycles, as
Yeah.
probably aware. And so so they were hiring their young geologists as well scouts. And you might ask, well, what's a well scout? Well, I didn't know either, but it turned out that it was a position where a person is given a company car and an expense account, and he or she is told to just go visit all the operators in your given geographic area, and mine was Pennsylvania, and trade information. And so I had continuous communication with our geology group in Clarksburg, and they would say, well, we're drilling here and we have these well logs that we're willing to trade, and this information, and here's what we would like. We would like logs from these operators in this area, and maybe we can trade. And so I would take this big pile of well logs with me and information about the results of some of the wells that we had been drilling, and I would exchange that for information from these other operators. And so every day I was going out to lunch with the different operators. So it's a really good way to learn the people in the
Right.
business, learn about the people in the business, and at the same time, learning about where these various operators are drilling and what they're drilling for and what the results are. And so it was kind of an interesting introduction, and that lasted about 9 months. And then what the company was doing is they had these young well scouts on staff, and then they would have an opening eventually and in their geology department. And so they would bring that well scout in, who already kind of knew a lot from his journeys every day and taking people out to lunch and talking with these old time operators. And we were just inserted into the department, and that's when I actually began working as a petroleum geologist, just mapping things out. And it was really just a lot of paperwork, like almost every job is,
Yeah.
working up well prognoses, and keeping maps up to date. And this is back before computers, by the way.
Yeah.
So everything we did took about 8 times longer than it does today for a young person going into that same type of job position.
Right.
So it was an interesting way to enter the industry, but you learn a lot about all the details involved, and just getting maps prepared that are meaningful and can tell a story, so that
Mm-hmm.
you can show your manager or a presentation, or whoever comes into the office that needs to understand what it is that your program is planning for that year. So, but it was a lot of fun, and there were a lot of other people there were a lot of other young geologists who are about my same age, and they we were all sort of doing the same thing, and it was an interesting community. I've been very fortunate in my career because I've worked for 3 large companies, large by Appalachian Basin standards,
Mm-hmm.
and then a couple of independents along the way. And we moved around a little bit. Our family moved around from Pittsburgh, from Clarksburg to Pittsburgh, to Ashland, Kentucky, to Houston, Texas, and then back to Pittsburgh. And I think it was a good experience in general for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And our kids seem to they seemed to acclimate pretty well with the moves. And so I think overall it was a good experience for the family.
Good. I think the most important question that I have is when did you start working with my dad and what was it like to work with him?
Okay. Oh boy, I better watch what I say here. No, well, first of all, I knew your dad in college. So we went to field camp together. We had some classes together at WVU. And then we went to field camp together. And let's see, this would have been in 1978, I think, because it was my junior year. And I believe he and I were in, trying to think if we were in the same group. I think we were, because it was maybe 20 students and we were divided into, groups of 5, I think, something like that. And we would go out every day and do our field mapping and then come back at the end of the day and, just, take all of our field notes and put them on a map and slowly try to figure out the structure and the correlated stratigraphy from outcrop to outcrop. And we were basically just building a geologic map as we went. And so that was I think that was like 5 weeks down at Camp Wood, West Virginia. So then I knew your dad from that, and we kept in touch, in the various companies that we worked for. And I think he started out at Ashland.
Yeah.
As his first job, and he stayed with them for quite a while. And then after I left Consolidated Gas in 1990, so I graduated in 79, and I worked for Consolidated Gas, and then they moved us up to Pittsburgh to form the CNG Development Company, and I worked there until 1990. I worked for 1 year for a company called Meridian in Pittsburgh. It was in the Gulf Building downtown, which was a really cool place. I mean, the building itself was just amazing, and it was a very different experience than I had at Consolidated Gas, because Meridian was all funded by investors and so forth. But anyway, that only lasted 1 year. It was a great job, but it was short-lived. So after that, I got hired on by Ashland in Ashland, Kentucky, and that's where I got to work with your dad again, or I got to work with your dad for the first time, I should say. So we worked together. I think he was working Pike County, Kentucky, drilling a lot of Devonian shale wells and Berea wells and everything in between. And then I was assigned to an area that was a little bit to the west of that. I think we called it the West Pikeville district or something. But he was sort of the old seasoned development geologist who had worked that area for a very long time. He knew it like the back of his hand. Oh, and then the other thing was, and also Joe Morris. He had also been a West Virginia grad, but I didn't know him in college. He was there, and then 2 other geologists. So we all got along really well. It was a great team. The other reason that I liked Ashland, and the reason that I wanted to work there, was because for years, I mean, maybe decades, they would drill 1 or 2 deep wells in the Rome Trough every year. And the name of the company was Ashland Exploration. So I remember thinking, well, this is going to be really great, because, I love exploration. And, the company drills these deep wells to the basement every year. And I wanted to be part of that. Well, the year that I came, they just, the company decided that they were just going to focus on development drilling only. And so no more exploration.
Oh, no.
So I got there, and it was, very different than it had been prior to, in terms of, the amount of money they spend each year on exploring the Rome Trough and drilling these deep basement tests. So all of that was in the files and was fresh on everyone's mind because they had, been doing this forever. And when I came along, it came to an end. But we still did continue to acquire, geophysical data and seismic data and so forth. So I got to work with that, and I picked your dad's brain a lot about past wells that he had been involved with, and Joe Morse as well. And so I got to work with the data and came up with some prospects and so forth, but nothing ever got drilled because the company was just finished with drilling exploration wells, and they were just focusing nothing more than development. And what that eventually led to was the company ended up being sold. And in advance of that, we were all given offers. I think this was in 1995. I remember the vice president of exploration and production down in Houston, Jeff Lawn. He was a very nice guy, and I ended up working with him for a year in Houston. Then he came up and gave the old "do as we say and no one gets hurt" speech. Mm-hmm. And we say that tongue in cheek, because basically what it means is we have a job for you, but it's in Houston.
Right.
And the company did decide to keep one geologist in Ashland, Kentucky, and that was your dad, Junior. And it was primarily because he had the most experience, working those plays, and he was the seasoned pro at the type of wells that needed to be drilled. And so I think that only lasted for another year.
Yeah.
And then that was the end of Ashland, and they sold to somebody, and the rest is history.
Yeah. I just remember going into his office when I was younger and playing with the colored pencils and looking at the maps, and it sounded like it seemed like a really exciting job to me.
Yeah. Well, I mean, colored pencils, come on.
Right.
Yeah, that's another interesting thing. I mentioned before how when I first started out, it was all before computers, and it wasn't really before computers, but it was before we applied computers to mapping, and before all of the software packages that are so common today were released. And I remember when I was in Pittsburgh, must have been like 1986, and we all were told that we were each going to get a computer. And I thought, well, first of all, I don't need a computer. I mean, and I have a secretary who can write all of my memos for me and all of my reports and so forth. And back in those days, you wrote everything longhand, you handed it to a secretary, and then she wrote it, typed it up. And I thought, well, that means I'm going to have to do all this typing. I don't even like to type. And it's called keyboarding, I know, but but anyway, those were my perceptions at the time. And it's just funny how that it's just so dramatically changed today. And you wonder where that's going to be in 20 years from now. I mean, we won't even have to touch anything. We can do that today, right? Voice to text. And I use that quite a bit, in fact, because I don't like to type.
Yeah. It's interesting what you said also about the maps kind of telling a story, because I imagine when you input that into a computer, it doesn't tell the same story, right?
Well, that's true. In fact, that's one of the battles that we've always had, particularly guys like your dad and me, where we grew up learning to contour and understanding just how important it is to, draw the contours with a bias. Like if you have a geological bias, you know that what you're drawing here is a channel sandstone or a point bar deposit or a barrier bar or something. You can instill that geological bias into how the contours are drawn, so that the geometry of that sand body or the structure and the structural grain, where the faults are, etc., you can put all of that into the map because you know what the data is telling you. You know not only what the data is telling you, but you know what the bias is that should be influencing how that map is drawn. Whereas, the software that we typically use today, I mean, it tries to do all of those things. There are ways that you can bias the way that the grid
Hmm.
um, sees the data and then draws the contours, but it's not quite the same as doing it by hand. And you get all these edge effects and a lot of bullseyes and weird things that aren't geological at all, that have to be fixed. And a lot of young people today, and not everyone's the same, obviously. I mean, some young geologists know and appreciate just what I said, even though they're younger and maybe not as experienced in that. But a lot of maps that I've seen, they're just, you set it up, press a button, and that's the map that gets shown in a presentation. And you cringe when you see it, because no, that's not right. But anyway, that's something that everyone has to struggle with.
Yeah, yeah. So, what are some of the other ways that you've seen the industry transform over the years?
Mm. Well, it's always been very cyclic, and we're going through a boom period now, although it's a very measured boom period, and I'm not involved with it because I'm retired. So I could tell you a lot more what it's like in this particular period if I was actually still working in the industry. But I can tell you from experience that the past boom bust cycles, it's a whole lot more fun going into a boom period than coming out of one,
Right.
because and it's all commodity price driven. So when natural gas prices go up or oil prices go up, companies hire. Um, I think the average length of a cycle is something like 7 years. It varies, obviously, but um, and it's typically what drives the spikes and the troughs in the commodity prices is a whole host of things. And you can imagine. I mean, you read the papers and you see what's going on. It's politics. It's world geopolitics.
Right.
Um, all sorts of things, perceived supply and demand changes, um, and a lot of it's built on emotion, and so it's not always a rational thing that
Right.
drives commodity prices. But um, let's see, I'm trying to get back to your original question. So um, you're wondering.
You're on track. You're on track. Yeah, I was just wondering how the industry has transformed over the years that you've experienced.
Yeah, for
Yeah,
sure.
were you trained like as a geologist to understand the geopolitics of it all? Was that part of your education, or was that something you had to learn along the way?
It's definitely something that I think most of us just learned along the way. I don't know if that's typically part of. I don't want to speak for others, I guess, but I don't think that's typically part of the training of a petroleum geologist, with the exception of maybe a class in, I don't know, current events or the history of oil or something like
Hmm.
that. But no, for me anyway, I think I just sort of learned that through having lived through it. And and okay, so to address your main question about how things have changed, well, I did mention, going from pencil and paper and erasers are a big part of it, by the way, because every line you draw, you erase about 3 times, and there's always a big thick pile of eraser dust underneath everyone's drafting table, and so that's changed a lot, obviously. And then also, I think certainly the type of drilling that we do today is primarily resource plays and horizontal drilling. And I remember when I was in Houston, um, our VP, Jeff Lund, one of the things that he told all of us was that, there's three main things that have changed that you're going to have to understand, be expert in if you want to survive in the industry. And one was horizontal drilling, one was 3D seismic, and one was new completion technologies associated with those horizontal wells. And I think for the geologists, the first two I mentioned were the most important, using 3D, and then understanding and being proficient at drilling horizontal wells, because that's where everything is today. All of the resource plays that drive production throughout the U.S. The reason that several years ago we were a net exporter of hydrocarbons, is because those resource plays are so prolific. And I like to say that we've gone from just the drilling of vertical wells. You only access so many net feet of pay with each well, whereas when you drill a horizontal well, I like to say we're going for the jugular, because basically you're drilling a horizontal well into the source bed that contains all of those hydrocarbons. In the past, most wells drilled into conventional reservoirs. So the source beds were what we call the kitchen, or that's where the hydrocarbons were generated. The heat and pressure over time caused the organic material to be converted into oil, and then eventually natural gas and everything in between. And then over geologic time, those hydrocarbons, due to the incredible amount of pressure generated during what's called catagenesis, or the conversion to hydrocarbons, that pressure drove those hydrocarbons up fractures and into pore space, whether it was a sand body or a oolitic limestone porosity zone or something like that. And so in the old days, we were just drilling, looking for those individual conventional pockets of hydrocarbons, whereas today we're looking at the actual source beds themselves. And the reason we didn't do that earlier was, we always knew there was, incredible volumes of hydrocarbons there, but first of all, they were considered too tight to be produced. In other words, the tiny little pore space, if there even was any, and we didn't even really understand that in those days, was not very well understood. And it was thought that because most of these source beds were shaly, that the clay particles would make it impossible to actually drill and produce hydrocarbons from these. But anyway, with completion technologies, fracking, and we've been doing fracking since the 40s. It's nothing new, but actually fracking a horizontal well in a source bed, black shale, organic shale, that's something relatively new. That was it was started. I guess maybe the credit is given to the Barnett shale play in Texas. And there was a couple of operators down there that sort of championed this with Mitchell Oil and Gas. Anyway, I guess I'm kind of getting long-winded on this.
That's okay.
But the point is that that's where the big changes occurred between the early days of conventional drilling and then where it's led today, and why we have such abundant reserves, because there's unbelievable amounts of hydrocarbons that can be produced this way.
Yeah.
That we never knew how to do that in the past, and now we do.
Okay. Yeah. So considering that, and your wisdom and experience of all the work that you've done, is there anything that makes this boom cycle more unique, and where do you see that going, especially with everything happening with Ukraine and Russia. And a lot of
Well,
people are asking why gas prices are rising here, um, because we have such an abundance.
mhm, mhm. Well, I don't consider myself an expert on answering that question. A lot of it has to do with politics and um, regulatory um, measures that have been put in place, the banning of um, pipelines. Um, I mean, for example, there was well, you all know about you know about the Keystone Pipeline, and it was supposed to bring oil from the tar sands in Canada into the United States and then supply refineries. So, various types of byproducts could be then refined, including gasoline. And so, without that, we're reliant more on, um, our own, resources here, which are, although they're abundant, um, I think for a combination of reasons, and I don't really want to get political in this
Right.
discussion, but for a variety of reasons, certainly including COVID, there have been a lot of folks who worked in the oil patch who no longer work in the oil patch, and so the manpower itself is probably down.
Hmm.
There are certain areas where maybe that's been able to continue better than others. I know in some of the basins in Texas, like the Midland Basin, um, oil production has stayed a little bit higher than some of the other shale basins. The Marcellus has seemed to do pretty well. But what's frustrating is you have issues in New England where um, there are a lot of people that are just anti-fossil fuels, and the political leaders are also, in general, anti-fossil fuels. And so, rather than building a pipeline from the Marcellus gas fields, into Boston and some of the other larger metropolitan areas in New England, and supplying those needs, we as a country um, import a lot of those hydrocarbons from places like Russia, and that makes no sense at all. And I think that changes in the wind,
Hmm.
but for the present time, that's a very common banter on Twitter and LinkedIn and
Right.
so
Yeah.
forth. You see that quite a
Hmm.
bit because it's just such an obvious flaw in our policy. And we do have the hydrocarbons and the reserves that are available to be produced in this country, so that we shouldn't have to be importing from places like that.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that'll change, but right now it's it is what it is.
Yes. Yes. So I want to get to your book because that's the whole reason that we're
Okay,
here.
great.
And so when did you choose to schedule this trip after you retired so you didn't have to think about all this stuff going on presently? What was that decision process like for you to say, okay, I feel like I've accomplished what I needed to in this career and I'm gonna take a
Yeah.
break?
Well, I mentioned about the boom and bust cycles, and in my career, I've actually been laid off 5 times, and for different reasons, but they all generally had to do with you know commodity prices, and you're dropping into a bust cycle, and things aren't going well for the company, and they have to start cutting staff and this and that. Um, so um, the last big layoff that I was part of was in 2017. And I had opportunities to do consulting and everything. And I thought, well, do I really want to do that? Or maybe this is just the time to just say, this is the end. I'm going to do all the other things that I've always wanted to do. And, there's so many more things in this world to spend your time and energy doing than working. So, and I was very fortunate that I could afford to do that. We could afford to do that. And so at that time, I just decided, okay, well, I'm going to call it good. And I'm retired. And so then I started, spending more time traveling and doing things like this Appalachian Trail hiking trip. And I've done several other hikes like that, but nothing quite as long as that. And the reason that I decided to do that was, I guess, multifold. One of the reasons had to do with, and by the way, I didn't start out planning to hike the Appalachian Trail. I started out just thinking, well, I think I'm going to hike for about a month down, in the southern part of the Appalachians, and why not start at, the Appalachian Trail and just hike that to Damascus, Virginia, which was about 500 miles. And that was more than I had ever hiked in my life prior to that. I mean, I had done backpacking my whole life, and but just short trips here and there, and maybe a week at the most. So, 500 miles, that was way more than I had ever bitten off. But I thought, well, let's see how it goes, and I've got time to do it, and it sounds like it would be fun. And I've always wanted to hike, at least some major part of the Appalachian Trail anyway. I grew up right next to it, and I used to hike all through Pennsylvania as a kid in scouts and so forth. But I had never done anything quite this large. So I started out in June of 2020, and I flew to Atlanta, Georgia, and then I took a shuttle drive up to the start of the trail, the southern terminus, which begins just north of Amicalola Falls State Park in Georgia, and stayed overnight at this really cool place. You had to actually hike in for 5 miles to get to this little retreat. And, they served dinner and breakfast the next morning, and then I was off. So I got to Springer Mountain on June 6th. And then after about a week, I thought, well, this is really hard, but I think I could probably do this for like why not just do the whole trail? So that's the point where I decided I was going to hike the whole Appalachian Trail. And so that's what I did. And I had to stop a couple of times. I had some family issues that I had to come home for. And but other than that, it was pretty much continuous for 5.5 months.
Wow.
When I got to Swatara Gap, Pennsylvania, which is about a little more than the halfway point, I took a week off, and my brother picked me up, and I visited with my brother and my mom for about a week, and then flew to Bangor, Maine, and then started the hike back. And actually, when I got to Bangor, I had tried for the week prior to that to get a reservation with Baxter State Park so that I could hike Katahdin, and then the remaining 10 or 15 miles to the end of Baxter State Park, and then start in the 100-mile wilderness. But there were no camping permits left because they only had so many. And I don't know if it's like that now or if this was a COVID thing. I don't recall. But I do remember, talking on 2 different occasions that week to rangers, on the telephone, and I explained exactly what I was doing, and they basically told me, well, there's nothing available. You'll just have to wait for about 3 days until, that following week. And I thought, well, that's ridiculous. So I got to Bangor, and I stayed in a place called Millinocket, at a really cool little hostel there. And I talked to some folks, and anyway, long story short, I never was able to hike Katahdin and back. And so that always really bothered me. But maybe not so much because I had done it in the past. Back in 2009, my son and I we had hiked Katahdin and then all over Baxter State Park for a couple of days. So I figured, well, I've already done that. It's not terrible that I'm not able to do it while I'm here. And I didn't want to wait 3 days. And it was getting late in the year. And I thought, really need to get moving if I'm going to get finished here by Thanksgiving. And when I flew to Maine, I remember I left Pennsylvania and I was camping every night, and it was really warm, during the day. We were in the midst of summer. It was like September 1st, September 2nd, thereabouts. And it was just beautiful summer weather in PA. And when I got to Maine, like it got down to like 30 degrees at night. And it was really a big change. It was like all of a sudden I feel like I'm late fall. And so I had this urgency that I needed to really get moving. And so anyway, so I started the 100-mile wilderness, which is right at the Baxter State Park boundary there. And I just started hiking south. But what was really frustrating for me, and it was on my mind like all day long, like I can't believe I didn't get to do Katahdin. Because that's like the capstone of everyone's through hike. But the way that I did it, it wasn't really the capstone, because it was like I thought of it as like an explanation point in the middle of a sentence.
Yeah.
It wasn't really the end of my hike. It was halfway through it. So it wasn't quite as bad, but it's still, I thought about that continuously. And everybody that I met along the trail, the first thing he says, "How was Katahdin?" And I look at them like, okay, how am I going to explain this in this like elevator speech? Because you pass people
Right.
all the time, right?
Yeah.
And so anyway, that was very frustrating. And I still have people today when I talk about it, and they see I didn't hike a ton. Well, you didn't really through hike. It's like, okay, you can call it whatever you want. But
Yeah,
what
I think 5.5 months counts for something.
I would think so.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But
Um
yeah.
so okay, so you were by yourself for 5.5 months pretty much, walking without much communication with people, I would imagine. I'm not sure what it's like to walk on that trail, but I imagine you had a lot of time with your thoughts and yourself.
I did,
Yeah.
and I would say that certainly the vast majority of my hike was by myself. I did have a couple stretches where I would meet somebody at a shelter area or at a camp one night, and then we would be on relatively the same pace. And that's really what it came down to, at least for me. Maybe not for others. I don't know. I think some people, they just decide they need to have what's called a tramily, a trail family, and that's very
Mhm.
cool. But in 2020, there weren't that many people on the trail, and B, it didn't really matter that much to me. I mean, I like to hike at my own pace, and if somebody keeps up with me, great. If someone's faster than me, great. But I'm not going to change my pace
Right.
to, just to stay with a group. So I had a couple of folks that I did hike with for days or even weeks, but that was pretty rare. So most of the time, yes, it was just me, and I'd see, anywhere from, 5 to 10, 20 people sometimes that I would pass during the day. And often I think more often than not, I would be camping with others each evening, because I would typically plan my day so that I would end up at a shelter area. Excuse me. And the reason for that, 1 second. Excuse me. And the reason for that is shelters always have a water source. They have the shelter in case you need it, in case there's a dramatic rainstorm around dinner time or something. But I would almost always just set my tent up and just camp nearby. And they also had usually they would have some type of a bear hang so that you could put your food up in up on bear cables or a bear box, and that was real important each night so that animals didn't get to your food. And then lastly, there was generally a privy there, which was kind of nice. It's just an outhouse in the woods. So little things that save time and are, a little more convenient than if you're just camping in some stealth campsite somewhere and you're not sure if there's going to be a water source and all
Right.
the other things I mentioned. But I would often see others in the evening. I'd say probably 80% of the time or better. So at the end of the day, might have been hiking by myself all day, but I get to talk to folks, and I'd always look forward to that. That was always, kind of a highlight of my day, is just, being able to sit down and have dinner with somebody I had never met before,
Yeah.
and hear all about their story and tell mine.
That kind of like goes back to your time of working your first job and taking people out to dinner, and getting to know them a little bit.
That's right. That's exactly right. Yeah. And hadn't thought about that, but I
Yeah.
guess similarities. Mhm.
Yeah. So, was there anything spending all this time by yourself that you learned about yourself? Was there anything that surprised you about yourself during this
Well,
time?
I'll tell you what, I would say yes. And a lot of it was the physical aspect of actually hiking. And this started in Tennessee, or I'm sorry, in Georgia, right off the bat. There's not a lot of relief on those mountains down there,
Hmm.
but every day you were just continuously climbing these steep trails. You get to a summit and it's beautiful, or you can feel the cool air and it's refreshing, and you feel like you've accomplished something, and then you could drop down into the next gap, and then you do it again, and then same thing, you drop down to the next gap and do it again. And and so those kinds of continual uh, uphill climbs, I mean, they are grueling, like you can't imagine. And I didn't know if I'd be able to do that. I was in pretty good shape when I started. My legs were in uh, pretty good condition from having spent about a year almost every day going over to nearby North Park here, and hiking around the 40 miles or so of trails. And I had a couple of loops that I did on a regular basis, anywhere from 4 to 6 miles a day. And then on weekends, there was an 8 mile loop that I liked, and I did that pretty frequently. So I was in pretty good shape for it. And even so, I felt like, I mean, I was never in the military, but I felt like I was in boot camp every
Hmm.
day. And I guess this was one of those things that after that first week, I decided, holy cow, I think I can actually do this. And so that's why I was going to, that's why I decided to hike the whole thing, because I wasn't really sure if I would have the stamina and the strength and et cetera, to do it at, at my young age of 62 at the time. So, so yeah, as far as what I learned about myself, certainly one of those things was, you know, I was a little bit surprised that I was able to, um, you know, do those climbs as well and efficiently, and I won't say without pain. My knee bothered me quite a bit from time to time, and my feet were always bothering me. I mean, you're at the end of the day, you have no idea what your feet feel like after doing 15 miles of this, rocky uphill trail all day long for 8, 10 hours. And the best thing is taking those shoes off at the end of the day and just plunging your feet into a cold stream, or just, putting, a pair of sandals on or whatever. So
Yeah. In addition, I imagine that the food supply was not so grand either. To
no, yeah, the food was sort of it was kind of I don't want to say feast or famine, but I guess the word I'm looking for is more. Um, well, I'll just describe it. How's that? About every 6 days or so, I would have to resupply, and what that resupply meant was I'd go into a small town, or sometimes it was just a convenience store,
Mm-hmm.
along a road that I would pass, and I would buy my next week's supply of oatmeal and beef sticks and cheese sticks and granola bars, Cliff bars, etc. And so I would have all the food that I would need for about the next 6 days, and I would load that into my food bag. And my food bag was anywhere from, after a resupply, it would add like 10 to 15 pounds to my pack.
Yeah.
So I was really glad that I had just resupplied, but all of a sudden my pack weighed so much more. And, the less weight you have on your back when you're climbing these mountains every day, the better. And I remember, a couple of times realizing I just way overbought this week. And each night for dinner, I would carefully pick out what I thought the heaviest items were, and that's what I would make for dinner, and same thing for lunch and everything else, and just try to drop that weight as quick as possible. And and it was definitely noticeable by the end of the week. I mean, I felt like I was lighter on my feet because I was than when I first resupplied each time. And I would also take a day off. Well, I wouldn't take a full day off, but I would take usually maybe I would roll into a hostel area mid-afternoon or maybe around noon, and then take the remainder of that day off, and just take advantage of having a bed to sleep in that night, or a cot or a bunk or something like that. And then also, I'd be able to do laundry if I felt like it, or if I felt like I needed to, maybe take a shower, and then even get like real food to eat just one night.
Yeah.
So each week I would generally do that. Sometimes I would spend maybe 2 weeks out on the trail, and figure out a way to resupply in the middle of that, because usually I would never go for more than about 6 days without a resupply. But I had different ways of doing that with some of the shuttle drivers. They would actually meet me and bring food, and um, but um, but that was always a kind of a welcome break each week. And so so I found that it was a way of, even though it was only about half a day that it would take off, it was a way of sort of relaxing my joints and my feet
Mm-hmm.
enough that I felt like I was refreshed and I could go out and tackle another week
Yeah.
of that abuse.
What was it that made you keep going?
Oh, I I think I just had set out in my mind that this is what I'm going to do, and I knew what my goal was. I could see the carrot at the end of the stick, and I really wanted to finish it. Um, yeah, it's you'd asked me, why I decided to do this, and I think another part of it was, when I was younger, I had some friends that were in my church group, and the four of them hiked the trail, and I was thinking about going along, and I ended up not going with them, and I always sort of regretted not
Mm-hmm.
having joined them. Um, and I remember we met. I think it was just one time when they were coming through Pennsylvania, and I remember feeling like, geez, I wish I would have been part of this. Why didn't I do this? And so that was one thing, and and it's just something that I had kind of always wanted to do, and I like to finish things when I start them.
Yeah.
So that was, I guess, just a driver. Mhm.
Yeah. Was your family supportive of this decision? Was there?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I think so. I
Yeah.
mean, definitely, yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. Yeah, I don't know if that. if everyone really thought that I was going to go the whole distance until like later on in the trip. It's like, oh, he's still out there.
Was there a moment on this adventure that you ever felt fearful or threatened about your survival?
um, yeah, there was one time, and I've told this story, many times to others. I think it was probably in mid-October, and I was up in the White Mountains, and the weather was not looking very good. It was cold and rainy, and I think I was hiking at the time with another hiker named Fenway. He was from Boston. He was a younger gentleman, and anyway, we were sort of keeping the same pace for um, a couple of weeks. I think we hiked mostly through the Mahoosics together. That's in southern Maine, through the Whites, and then pretty well all the way through to the end of New Hampshire. But anyway, so it was one night we were staying in a hut together. It was one of the shelters up there. I believe it was on Mount Garfield. And the next morning was going to be the Franconia Ridge track. And so the idea was we would get out and we would hike to the top of Mount Lafayette, and then I think it's Mount Lincoln, then Mount Haystack or Haystack Mountain, and then Liberty, and then on down into the next notch, as they're called in New England. They don't have gaps in New England; they have notches, and it's all because of glacial, enhancement of the valleys and so forth. But anyway, so get up the next morning. It had rained all night, and we started. I remember we started up towards the edge of the vegetation, the edge of the tree line, and because it was all uphill, I remember taking my jacket off and putting it back on, taking it off, because it was kind of raining off and on the whole time, and it was cold. But for me, my rule of thumb was, when I'm going uphill, I don't like to have a rain jacket on, because it's almost like a sweatsuit,
Mm.
and it's so uncomfortable, and it makes me perspire, and I'll get more wet from perspiring than from the rain, and then even if it's raining, my body heat kind of dries everything for me as I'm hiking, as long as I'm going uphill. And so it was really cold, so I kept putting it on, taking it off, putting it on. So when we finally got to the tree line, you could tell the wind was really fierce, but we were in the forest, and so it wasn't so bad there. But when we got to the top of the tree line, I remember looking up, and the wind was just like unbelievable, and it was blowing snow and rain, at the side of my head. And I looked up, and it was kind of hazy and hard to see, but it was just nothing but rock, like straight up,
Oh, wow.
which was fine. It was very cool, except it was all covered in ice. so and it was kind of hazy, so you really couldn't see the top, but as far as you could see, it was just nothing but ice covered rock. So anyway, that's what we had to look forward to to get up and over Mount Lafayette. And so I remember Fenway, we were kind of keeping pace for a while, and then pretty soon, he was much faster, younger, and stronger than I was, so he took off, and he was out of sight after a while. And so I was kind of on my own, trying to figure out, okay, where are these white blazes? Because it was hard to see. And typically on the AT, I mean, there's white blazes every couple hundred feet or so. And so you always know, where the trail is. And it was hard to see these. It was hard to see the white blazes because of the conditions, and primarily the ice covering all the rocks. And it was really hard to navigate on these rocks. Anyway, you can imagine. So after a couple of hours, I get to the top, and it is just completely, you know, like you're in the middle of a cloud and 60-mile-an-hour winds, etc. And by the way, Fenway, I remember on the way up, he had these brand new rain pants, and the wind literally shredded like the rubber coating off of these rain pants. And I remember all he had left was like the linen part that's
Wow.
the liner underneath. I mean, that's how intense the wind was. And this is nothing unusual for the White Mountains, but this was my experience. And everybody that you meet who's been on the AT through the White Mountains, they all have these near-death experiences. And it's something different for everybody, but that was mine. So anyway, long story short, it just took me all day to get up and over these ridges, and finally, got down into the notch. And interesting story, when I got down into the notch, finally down, at ground level again, or at base level, and there's a road there, and I was supposed to meet a shuttle driver at a certain location, which was maybe only a quarter to a half a mile away down the road. And so as I'm hiking down the road, this New Hampshire state policeman pulls up behind me, and he jumps out and he goes, "What do you think you're doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm just going to meet my shuttle driver down the road." And he goes, "No, you're not allowed to hike on the road." I said, "Well, how about if I just hop over the guardrail and he said, "No, you're not allowed to do that." He said, "You have to go back to the trail and take the trail to the nearest parking area." And this was way, way out of my way. So I thought, oh my gosh, I mean, you have no idea what I've gone through today. First of all, I just want to get the heck out of here, And so he told me to get into the squad car, and I thought, oh, great, now what? So I throw my pack in, I slide in next to it and close the door, and I realize, like, this is just like in the movies, like there's no door handles or window cranks or anything.
Oh, no.
So I'm kind of stuck in there. And so he gets in and he asks me for my information and calls me into the station or whatever, and they check to make sure I'm not a serial killer, I guess, or whatever. So then, I'm sitting there, and we just, start talking a little bit. And I told him, I was from Pittsburgh, I'm a retired geologist, I'm just out hiking the Appalachian Trail. I had a really hard day and blah, blah, and this and that. And he kind of looked up in the mirror, and he goes, I went to Pitt and I took a geology class. I thought, oh my gosh, that's great. And so then we started talking, and so then he goes, "Okay, so where is it you wanted to go?" And so he ended up driving me to the location and dropping me off, which was the right thing to do. And it was very kind of him. And I guess he could have written me up a ticket or whatever, but he didn't. Very, kind policeman. So that's how my day ended.
All right. Excellent. So did you take notes along the way? Did you journal? Like, how did you
I did.
record this experience? Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a good question. And I didn't really start out thinking that I was going to write a book, but I did take trail notes every night, and I ended up, I have them right by my side. I don't know why they're still here, but I had these little notebooks, and just every day I would write a page or two or three about things I experienced, what the weather was like, what the most difficult hikes were like for the day, and people I met, and a little bit about them. And I wasn't really sure what I was going to do with them, but I just thought, well, I should really document this in some way. And a couple of folks that I met along the way, they had said, well, you should write a book. And I thought, well, we'll see. I've never done that before. And so I, when I got back, and I even thought of, like, you have a lot of time to think about things, right?
Right.
When you're out there hiking every day.
Yeah.
So I remember even thinking, like, what would I call this book? And I thought, Rocks, Roots, and Rattlesnakes, that's perfect, because that's what you're looking at all the time. So you don't trip and hurt yourself, break an ankle or whatever. I mean, you're always looking for the next rock and avoiding the roots. And certainly in the afternoon, in the summertime, you're looking for rattlesnakes on every step of the way. So I thought, well, that's perfect. That exactly describes, what my focus is nearly the whole time on the trail. So when I got back, I just put all these notes together, and I mentioned text to speech before, how I like to use that. And so that's actually the way that I created the first crude form of the story. Was I literally just, I read into my iPhone, what I said every day. And then I would copy and paste that from, I think it's the Notes app, into an email, and then I'd email that to myself, and then copy and paste that into a Word document. Before I knew it, I had, like 50 pages of a Word document. And then what was key to having each day journaled was that, yeah, sure, I didn't remember every single thing that I wrote down each day, but when I would read that day's notes, it would take me back to that day, and then I could remember, oh yeah, and then I did this, or I met this person, or things that I hadn't transcribed at the time. And it would just take me back to that day, so that I could very easily add content and information and
Yeah.
more interesting stories. So that's how the book was built. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, to summarize your book, is there a specific overall theme or message that you would like to deliver to an audience?
Well, I think the underlying, there's a couple of things. Certainly the underlying story is just my adventures each day, and the people I met, and the things I did, and the obstacles that I went over. And in fact, I used to think of this as, rather than calling it the Appalachian Trail, it should be called the Appalachian Obstacle Course, because it more described it. But then the other underlying theme certainly was the rocks, right?
Yeah.
The geology that was under my feet the whole time. And and that's something I was thinking about all the time. Like every time I would climb the next mountain, I'd be looking at the rocks like, well, these are different than the rocks I saw. And then I didn't have a rock hammer, so I couldn't get a fresh surface. So typically you're just looking at a weathered surface of a boulder or an outcrop, and it's kind of hard to tell just exactly what that is. And I would take a guess, and a lot of the notes I ended up writing down were probably wrong. But I went back and corrected everything when I returned, and I actually got down to the point of writing this all up. But yeah, it was really interesting to me, just noticing the rocks. And then when I got into the Valley and Ridge province, which is the sedimentary section, because most of the hike is along the Blue Ridge, or in the New England provinces, and nearly everything up there is metamorphic, meaning it's not sedimentary rocks. They may have been sedimentary at one time, but they were buried, tens of miles beneath the earth at one time and transformed into metasediments. And so most of the rocks were not sedimentary. But when I was in the sedimentary basin in the Valley and Ridge province, I was much more familiar with those rocks. And so that was a lot more, I don't want to say it was more interesting, but I could better identify the kinds of rocks that I was, seeing each day. And it was interesting, a lot of the ridge lines were capped with the Tuscarora sandstone, or the equivalent to the Tuscarora sandstone, which is a Silurian sandstone unit. And there's a reason for that, because the Tuscarora is such a tough ridge forming, weather resistant unit, that it commonly caps a lot of the ridge lines. And so the trails often follow those kinds of rocks. So, so those are the things that I guess would represent the underlying themes of the book.
Yeah.
And I think it's a good story. There's a lot of humor in it. Um, a lot of it's self-deprecating because I'm out there by myself and I'm doing dumb things all the time. Like one night I was running out of water, and I think this was in Maine. And I could see on the map there's Bemis Creek running through this little valley. I think that's what it was called. And so first I came down the trail, and there was a road there and overlooked this really nice lake. And I'm looking around, where in the world does the trail go? Because sometimes, you would temporarily lose the blaze, and it's like, well, I can see people have been walking here, so that must be it. And then I'll see a blaze up ahead. So I started down this trail, and I'm looking, and all of a sudden it just sort of like, disperses in all different directions. And okay, well, that's obviously, this isn't the trail. So I turn around and I climb back up this steep embankment, and there are these two people at the top, and I can see them watching me, um, and I'm thinking, okay, they look like they have something to tell me. So I get to the top, and of course the guy, he says, if you're looking for the trail, it's over there, and then as I'm looking at him, I see a white blaze on the post right next to him. Like, oh, how did I miss that? Well, okay. So I kind of slither away. And then when I get down into the valley looking for a campsite, um, I crossed over like 3 or 4 dry creek beds. And it's important to have water each night because you can't cook, you need water, you need it for
Yeah.
the next morning, all that stuff. Well, I get to the bottom and I'm thinking, man, where is the creek? And this one's dry, crossover, there's another one. This one's dry, crossover. And the last one I crossed, I remember it was a good sized stream, and it was nothing but boulders. And I thought, well, I guess the stream's dried up. So I'm out of luck. No water. And so I think I had like a half liter left for the night and the next morning and everything. So I thought, okay, well, I'm going to be really careful and just use a minimal amount of water. Normally when I would get to camp at night, I would drink about a liter of water, and, like, just to recharge from
Yeah.
that day. So I had hardly anything to drink. And I remember I set up my stove early. Normally I would go through a certain procedure. I'd get the tent set up. I'd get camp all organized so that the last thing I would do is make dinner, and then I could just relax, have dinner, and then clean up, hang my food bag and all that stuff, and then go into my tent and do my evening ritual of checking my maps and planning the next day and journaling and everything. Well, so I did a little different this one night. So I decided, well, I'm going to cook my dinner because I was so hungry and I was thirsty and everything. And I knocked my stove over.
Oh no.
And I was cooking mashed potatoes or something, and all of a sudden they're all over the ground, and big mess. And I lost half of my food. I had no water, and then I had food all over the ground that's going to smell and attract the animals. I thought, oh, this is like the worst of all possible situations. So I cleaned all that up and finally made some dinner and ate a whole bunch of dried something or other. I don't remember what it was. Next morning I get up and I'm thinking, oh man, what am I going to do? There's no water, blah, blah, blah. So I walk about 100 feet and there's this beautiful stream right there. I just hadn't gone far enough to find. But anyway, it was a nice surprise for the next morning, and I was able to get my my water bottles filled and everything.
Yeah.
So that worked out.
That's a metaphor right there.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can think of several.
Yeah. So if people would like to purchase your book and read about your adventures and everything that you learned from this trip, where could we send them?
Well, I have a website and it's called Rocks, Roots, and Rattlesnakes. And it's no punctuation, no spaces, just rocks, roots, and rattlesnakes.com. And and I set that up on my website. You can pre-order the book, and there's also different parts of the website where you can read excerpts from the book. Um, you can also read about me. You can also read about some of the other trips that I've recently taken, some of the other trails that I've hiked. I did the Long Trail, for example, last year, which is through Vermont. It's a 273-mile trail, the oldest continuous footpath in the country, which is really cool because, back in those days, they didn't think much about making it easy for the hikers. They come to a valley and then just straight down and then straight back up. And really, it's a tough trail. But anyway, so you can find my book on my website.
Okay.
And I think it'll be enjoyable for both hikers and folks who would like to hike, but maybe they aren't so inclined, but they like to read about the adventures of folks who have done this type of thing.
Yeah. Great. I will add the links to the show notes so people can click on it really easily.
Okay, great.
Yeah. So I have one last question that I usually ask my guests to sort of wrap up. And that question is, if your inner voice had a billboard, what would it say to the world?
Don't wait too long to fulfill your dreams and your desires for adventures such as this.
Yeah.
And for everyone, that means something different, obviously. But, I look at a lot of the folks that I met along the trail, they were much younger than me. And I mean, they blew me away as far as their pace and their endurance and their pace. I don't know about their endurance. I think, I've had a lot of experience with young people like racing past me, but I think at the end of the day, I may have had a little bit more gas left in my tank than they did. But anyway, I guess the point is, don't wait till it's too late. And there's lots of things like this out there to be done, and that are just amazing experiences that you can't even put into words until you actually go through them and experience them yourself.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thank you, Whitney.
Thank you so much for joining me this week. If you're listening and you like what you hear, please consider subscribing and rating this podcast, as it really helps get this podcast out to other people who might be interested in hearing it but don't know about it yet. And also, if you'd like to contact me or reach me, you can reach me at unconditioningpodcast@gmail.com or unconditioningpodcast on Instagram. Thank you so much. And until next time, stay tuned in to you.